people buy you, not as much the product or whatever gadget you're selling, because there are a lot of competitors in the workplace.
Hello Sales Nation and welcome to today's episode of the show. On today's episode we have Elinor Stutz. She is a sales expert, and on this episode we're diving into relationships, the importance of forming them in B2B sales, the importance of doing things differently so that you stand out, and a whole lot more. You can find out more about Elinor over at smoothsale.net. We link to her books and everything else in the show notes of this episode over at salesmanpodcast.com. With all that said, let's jump in to today's episode. Elinor, welcome to the Salesman Podcast.
Well, thank you for having me as your guest today, Will.
You're more than welcome, and I'm excited to have you on. We're going to dive into one of my favourite topics. It's something that within the vast range of sales and the guests that come on, I feel like I might be able to add a little bit of something to today, very humbly, because this is my background and this is selling through relationships. So I'm going to ask you, Elinor, here now. I know, and the audience might even cringe as I ask it, because this is the most basic question that probably ever asked on the whole of the show, but I want to get your thoughts on this. Why do relationships close deals? Because we talk about all the analytics, the emailing, all this kind of stuff that we can measure, but in something that's slightly less measurable perhaps, why do relationships close deals, and why should we be aiming to have more and better relationships with our potential customers?
I'm going to give you two answers, Will. The first is I was taught early on that people buy you, not as much the product or whatever gadget you're selling, because there are a lot of competitors in the workplace. And what I've come to learn over time is a quote that I developed, that trust is the soul of sales. So when people feel they know you, like you, and can trust you, that's when sales start exploding. In a good way.
Yeah. And what's going on here, though, because we all know this perhaps anecdotally or in our guts even, that if there's two names on a piece of paper in front of us, we're going to go with the person that we like the most. And like obviously comes from trust, it becomes from rapport. We don't need to dive into neuroscience or anything that deep, of course, but what's going on when we look at those two pieces of paper and we go, all right, I'm going to go with that individual because they've just spent a bit more time with me and I feel like I know them better?
Well, usually the person that you feel you know better did a better job of examining the person's needs, wants, and desires, the problems they're encountering, and gave a better explanation of how their service will help them bypass all those issues and get to where they want to be. It's a long process. It's not a simple answer.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you just turned this on its head, which I appreciate, in that is the relationship the end product of doing everything right? As in, we need to focus on building the trust and the value, all this good stuff, and then the relationship happens, versus I think a lot of people talk about, right, if you build a relationship, the deal will come in. Should we be thinking more about doing the right things and the process of that versus focusing on the outcome?
I believe so. In fact, I tell people that the initial sale doesn't even matter. What you need to focus on is the long-term relationship so that you have a returning and referring clientele. That's my definition of the smooth sale. When you do a job well, take your time, have patience, and really get to know people, that's when the relationship builds and that repeat business happens. And then I turn the question around. Think about a time you bought from somebody you didn't particularly like. The question becomes, did you purchase from them a second time?
Well, yeah, I think almost by definition, I guess, if you're buying from someone that you don't like, they're probably the quickest solution, or they are the one with least friction, or they just physically have stock of the thing that you're trying to buy, right? It's almost last case scenario at that point.
Exactly. And if I can share a humorous story to point out what's going on here, everybody needs to know their priorities and values. Once upon a time, I met with a female decision maker, which was unusual in my day. So I was really excited to go meet her. And to my horror, she was extremely rude to me. So getting back to the office, I hand wrote a note saying, I'm very sorry, but I don't believe I can help you, but I know someone who does. And I thought I'd get the last laugh. I introduced her to the most egotistical salesman I ever encountered. And a month later, the two of them were on the phone calling to thank me for introducing them. They wound up dating.
So I guess this comes down to the fact that, well, I don't know, we're going off topic here, but part of the show, Elinor, is that I want to help people thrive in sales, not necessarily just hit the target. So I think there's relevance here. When we are building relationships with individuals internally within our own company, which is clearly important, and then with potential customers as well, should we be trying to align ourselves with people that are similar to us? And what I mean by this is okay, I never thought about this before. Is there low-hanging fruit within our pipeline, within our potential customers, of people that are similar to us, perhaps, or that have similar hobbies and interests? And should we focus our relationships on those first, from the long-term kind of like plan and goal of all this, versus I think most people will focus their time on whoever's going to do the biggest deal first, potentially?
Right. I suggest having a mix. Obviously, the low-hanging fruit will get you started, and you need to prove yourself, particularly if you're on a new job. And it's far easier to work with people who think similarly. But at the same time, there should always be a mix of very large corporations in your pipeline, if that's within your territory, and some difficult people, because I feel from every experience, good and bad, in particular the bad, if you're willing to learn from every error, every experience, you are going to be a stellar salesperson by the time you get past all those hurdles. So challenge yourself to work with a mix. That's my advice.
So I like what you did there. You almost took the responsibility on yourself versus I have the audience who email me and they say, how do I deal with this difficult person? They're being a right pain in the arse. They're not letting me do this. They're blocking me with this. But what you just described was to see it as a challenge and take responsibility for it versus putting the blame on them, right? Is that the way that we should be approaching this?
I believe so. I mean, in some circumstances, people are really mean. But if you can get past that, smile and view, I always view these circumstances as a game to see if I can find the strategy to get past those hurdles and make it work. So I have numerous examples. If later in the conversation you want some of them. But it's your attitude that'll get you past the tough people and to the right decision makers.
I know from my experience of dealing with very fiery surgeons, unfortunately, just the very typical stereotype of a surgeon, of a kind of like, how to describe it, almost like a jockey, kind of overconfident, overbearing individual who's shouting at everyone in the operating theatre, rightly or wrongly. I know in my experience of these types of people that if I just smile long enough and just take all the shit that they're throwing at me when they're being difficult, because they're in a very stressful situation, to have that empathy there to understand that, we're selling medical devices, we're selling B2B equipment, we're selling things that the consequences are in their hands and, they've got real responsibility. I think obviously having that empathy perhaps deflates the amount of difficulty that a customer is, or potential customers putting in front of you. But I know from my experience, if I just smile long enough, everything just deflates eventually, doesn't it? If you got someone difficult, if you're professional and if you're doing the right things for long enough, I always find that most people come around.
Absolutely. That has been my experience too. In fact, I was always called a breath of fresh air because when I was in meetings with people, I would smile and get to know where their perspectives were first. And if they objected to something I said, I would ask what's been their experience, why do they believe that? And they were stunned. And they all said at the end of each meeting, you're a breath of fresh air. That became my personal brand.
I'll tell you, so this is fascinating. So my personal brand internally was that I'm just a good guy, that I'll do the right thing. I'll work hard. I'll do the job. We'll get it done. And it was simple as that. So it's interesting. And is this something that we should try and develop and culture to have a personal brand? And everyone's different. It might be that you are the super prompt, on time, you get everything done and it's perfect to the letter, which in the world of medical devices is super important, clearly, with all the legislation and the logistics of not being sued on the back of it. So that might be a real enticing personal brand to have, both internally and externally, in a company like that. But I've never thought about it like this before. We've talked about personal branding loads of times on the show, but it's more of like an element of trust. Should we be kind of giving a feedback loop of, hey, I'm this, and this, live up to it, and then allow that to feed back into the reputation? Is that something that we should have a focus on when we're building relationships in B2B?
Yes. Online, you see, with content, you need to be consistent, but our words, actions, and deeds need to be consistent. Everybody needs to be able to identify us. In order to refer us, should we do the best job that they have ever witnessed? And, ask us to be their supplier, their vendor. And it's very important that people know they can count on you. It's almost like you're a box of Cheerios. Wherever you go, people know what they're going to get.
I'm doing loads of traveling, going back and forth with the States at the moment. And you guys, there's some, and not just in the States, when I've done a couple of trips in Europe recently as well for these different sales events. Everywhere has it's so funny, everywhere has such a crazy range of cereals. The ones I notice everywhere are cornflakes and Cheerios. So it's you've obviously pondered on this before. But Elinor, let's get practical about this for a second. So it's one thing to say, right, there's value in relationships. We should all go out and build them. We should be authentic. We should have a message or a code of conduct almost that we're living up to, which allows people to refer us, and it gives them a message so that we're easily referable. It's one thing to say all that. But is there a process to put this in place from, I don't know where it starts. Does it start with the first email you send and end after, or never end, but, come to a conclusion after they referred you? Or does it start when you walk into the room? Should you be super corporate and show no personality until you're in front of them? Or, how do we go about this? And how do we put in a process? So for the audience listening now, they can listen to this show, they're driving on the way to the office, they can put it into practice as soon as they get there.
Well, if you want to start at the beginning of the sales cycle, it usually starts with an email or phone call, but prior to that is the research, so you have something intelligent to say. I think one of the big errors I see is, especially in email, hey there, you need our service. First of all, how do they know I need it? And my name is not hey there. It really turns me off.
I mentioned this on an earlier recording today, but I've got this one Silicon Valley company emailing me at the moment. I did not sign up to the list. I've unsubscribed and they continue to push emails to me. It's unfortunate because the product is a perfect fit for me to talk about on the show through either, a paid partnership and that side of things, or just organically. There's a bunch of companies that just give me free accounts to stuff, and if I use it, I like it, I'll talk about it, and they get tens of thousands of people are hearing it every day. So all that in the back of things, all that in the back of the conversation here, they keep emailing me saying, "Hey Betty," that's the opening line of the email, and I've unsubscribed for it multiple times, and it's still, "Hey Betty, this is what we're doing today," blah 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 blah. So I'm hesitant to kind of like name and shame them because clearly it's a mistake. Someone's screwed up, and I'm appreciative that everyone makes mistakes occasionally. But I will never do business with that company now. They've put a real bad taste in my mouth, and if that company gets brought up on the show, that's probably when I'll say, hey, they've been emailing me saying, "Hey Betty," for the past 6 months or however long it's been. So it does matter, doesn't it?
It matters a lot, and that's the perfect point. And then moving forward, let's say you have an appointment or people still cold call. Either way, there are no totem poles in stature. The important point is to treat everybody as the CEO of their own job. And I'll give you quick samples. I was trying to get into both a Fortune 500 and a Fortune 100 corporation once upon a time. And I've had difficulty speaking to the decision makers. So in the Fortune 100 case, I went to the guy in the basement and treated him like he was the king of the company. And the Fortune 500, I had to go to a poor side of town down a dark alley with barking dogs. I was scared out of my mind, to tell you the truth. They were working out a warehouse, but once I met them, I treated them like they were the king and queen of England too. They reported back and said no one has ever treated them that way, and that the decision maker had to buy from me. Within 3 months, I had the Fortune 500 company as my client. I took it away from the most well-known brand of the day. And the Fortune 100 company, it became my client because the way he was treated.
And I can't remember the way to describe it here of, manners are free or something like that, but that's what it comes down to. It's just a bit more time, having good manners, and obviously research comes into it as well. And there's a skill to that of researching someone on the internet and being able to relay conversations on the back of it. But how much of this is just being polite, speaking to everyone that you meet versus just that one person who can close the deal? Because clearly they're both free and they're both resources that anyone can leverage.
For me, the whole sale begins with each person you meet. Treat them all equally, because you never know who they know. In fact, in the down economy, someone I know was able to get the most enviable job in the midst of the big bust. And I asked her how she did it. She said she went online, noticed the guy went to the same high school. They knew some of the same people. Turned out he lived in the same neighborhood. And so just by doing a little research, she was able to make that personal connection. And next thing you know, she asked for an informational interview and he offered her the job on the spot. That rarely happens, but it happens.
Let me ask you this, Elinor. And I want to just give context to the audience here. So clearly your experience in sales goes beyond what mine does in of course, depth, but in years as well. Is the internet a help or a hindrance to this? In that clearly there's way more data than ever before. Clearly we can now just ping an email and it just appears somewhere. We don't need to be sending faxes or letters or trying to get people on the phone when there's only one phone in the office and you're a payphone down the end of the street kind of thing. And I'm exaggerating slightly here, but has this want and desire and the necessity of networking locally and having conversations with people like you just described then, is this somewhat of a dying art because the internet has made it so easy to connect? And is that a good thing or a bad thing, in that clearly the internet makes it loads easier, so there might be less value in doing it?
I have to tell you, when I first heard about social media, it was my wish come true, because in the old days, we were tasked with knocking on 50 doors per day, and I never wanted to be average, so I promised myself to do 60 a day. In my opinion, social media turned the sales funnel upside down, the process. And the world is at your fingertips. So again, it comes down to your values, priorities, the type of people or the companies you wish to connect with. And then again, it's the same process. You research people or look at their profile. It's easier now. Get to know something about that person where you have a commonality and send a 2-3 sentence brief introductory message using their name. And people connect and they refer you. I mean, I have built up a huge following over time, and that never would have happened without social media. It's incredible.
Are we going to look back at this social selling, social media age, especially where we are now, when it's not done very well by most salespeople, and so you can break through the noise very easily by just a super well-researched and targeted email to an individual that's so different to what most sales professionals are doing, and marketers as well, so that it can really break through the noise? Are we going to look back at this moment in time in 5 years and be like, holy heck, man, we should have doubled down on this, because now there's obviously way more noise and spam out there? Is this the golden era of sales and building relationships?
In my opinion, it is. When it was announced a number of years ago, I embraced it wholeheartedly, and I joined a group to learn the better methods for communicating. The person in charge was a marketing genius, and my style matched hers. And so it worked highly effectively for me. And people told me I was nuts. I was going to ruin my business. Today, I'm known as a top 1% influencer. But it's the same as the old-fashioned email where you say, hey there, and the messaging on Twitter, if you want to send somebody a message. I like your tweets. You inspire me. I love the pictures. I'm interested in your work. Would you like to share your email so I can learn more? And maybe we can find synergy between us. When they say yes, they respond, and you respond as quickly as possible. Go to LinkedIn and look at their profile. To me, it's the 1-2 dance, Twitter, LinkedIn. And you get so much more information about them, and then you can ask for a conversation. I think it just eliminated a whole lot of wasted time in the sales. I love it. That's all I can tell you. I'm prejudiced in favor of social media.
I love it as well. We're on the same wavelength. I honestly think the way that some sales experts and definitely some salespeople who were around at the time look back at the time where they could make hundreds of thousands or, in some cases, millions of dollars a year by cold calling people. And because that was new, you could break through the noise and you could build a relationship on the phone. Clearly, you need to be... Well, I'll ask you this in a second, whether we need to be on the phone or in person to really build a relationship. But I think some people look back on that very favorably, rightly or wrongly, and clearly it worked at one moment in time. And I think we're going to look back at this in 10 years and think, we should have doubled down on it. We should have worked on our personal brands. And hopefully the audience, some of this is sinking into them, because I know I've had huge benefits from growing my personal brand from being on the show, almost from osmosis from people like yourself, Elinor, of kind of your reputation rubs off on me just very slightly on each of these interviews that I do. And I know the opportunities that I have now are crazy compared to 2 years ago when I had zero personal brand online. But let me ask you this, because we'll bring it down to earth slightly for a second before we get before we go too far with it all. So if we are now going to use social media, perhaps that's your initial outreach and it's your tool to pull together a series of knowledge about the individual or some specific points that you can initially build rapport with, and that small talk that we have on every phone call or every meeting before we get down to the business itself. Do relationships get formed in that initial email, or can we form relationships in that initial email, or should we always be pushing for the phone call or, if possible, that in-person sit-down meeting? Is it possible to sell over email, or do we need to get people on the phone?
Ultimately, you need to get people on the phone, but I think if you send an email, you can make it intriguing enough where they want to speak with you. That's the key. The problem is most people try to sell in the email, and that, in my opinion, is the wrong approach.
And how do we go about doing that? What's a practical example of, not to put you on the spot too much here, but of an intriguing email that makes me go, wow, I want to ring that person. Never mind, have them leave 15 voicemails and chase me.
All right, begin it with, well, dear, or, hi, Mary, however you want to phrase that. Dear is probably very old fashioned, but hi, Mary. And then start with you or their perspective. Your work is highly impressive. I was amazed to find you do XYZ, and I'd like to learn more. Where this might be worth your time, this is where I see our synergy, in the second paragraph. And third, please send me a choice of dates and times that work for you, and I will look forward to either connecting by phone, by Skype, or an in-person meeting. Let me know what you prefer. As simple as that. You just make it very brief, compelling enough that the person thinks, wow, they took time to research me, and I'm kind of interested in that part of my work. And that's when the magic starts to happen.
How do we know how interesting it is? And the reason I ask that is the formula that you just give us could either be an amazing email that if someone... So I get pitched regularly at the moment for hosting services, things of this nature, because the audience know that my hosting keeps crashing because we get spikes of traffic, and it's a good problem to have. But I get the audience, which is fantastic that they're pitching me, because I'm more than happy to. I'd rather give my business to one of the audience members than just some random, male or female or whoever who's kind of vying for it. So that's fine. But that template you just shared, that could be this amazing email of, I'm a huge fan of the show. I enjoyed this episode. I really took this away from it. What do you think about this? I know this is a hot topic for you on the conversations and that you're having recently. I'm going to go to this event that you're doing live shows at in Chicago or New York later on in the year, or in the HubSpot one in Boston. There's crazy opportunity there for them to build a whole load of rapport to get me excited. But in the same breath, that formula is also used by every single salesperson to some extent to spam as well, where all they're doing is changing your name, and they've been on Twitter and they see that you like playing golf, and so they go, hey, I play golf as well. Here's my product. Let's get a phone call in the diary. How do we know whether this is a great email or whether we shouldn't be sending it?
Well, I would vary the verbiage for each person. I wouldn't copy and paste. I'd personalize it. And that comes in the research. But at the same time, you had asked about social media, and then we spoke about email. One point I'd like to make is that people learn and respond differently. Some are auditory, through listening, others visual, and others kinesthetic through the touchy-feely process. So I believe it's best to use a mix of approaches to see what works best. And I want to tell you, it just came to mind as you were speaking about something that I did long ago. I was selling high-end printers, color and black and white. And so I would get greeting cards that made me laugh. The front picture would just have me howl. For example, one was the picture of a truck high in the limbs of a tree. And I put a caption underneath it saying, set your goals higher. And I would mail these flyers to each of my desired prospects once a month. And when I knew that they received 3 of them, because like you said, some may get tossed out or ignored, I would pick up the phone to call for an appointment, and they would all say, please come in. We're dying to see who's so creative in sending these out. And that's how I got all my appointments. Plus, they were hung up on all the walls, and some people had a dozen because it took a long time to get to them, and it drove all the competitors out.
Yeah, I love this. And I think there's a cautionary tale within this as well, Elinor, of I get the same emails from a lot of my audience regularly. And this is because they have Googled what is the best email template for technology sales, and HubSpot have done a blog post with 4 templates, and they've copied and pasted the template. And so I'm going, I'm sure I've said this before, and it's from one of their competitors. It wasn't even someone from internally. So in the internet age, I think we need to be creative like what you were and not lazy. And I think that if we double down, and what you just described would still work perfectly now, wouldn't it? You could still do that and send even it might even work even better now, because we're not used to getting mail in the post, especially at work internally. That might be the breath of fresh air that we've been searching for all morning, versus if you send that over an email, it perhaps is more fleeting. It doesn't have that impact that it does on paper. So perhaps things of that nature have become even more valuable just to break through the noise. So I'm always cautionary on this of, one, if you can Google it and it's the top result, you probably shouldn't be doing it. And then 2, social media is obviously being super hyped up at the moment. That term social selling is everywhere within the sales industry. But there's just as much value in the social element to it as there is doing what no one else is doing and just taking that step extra. And I guess from a deeper level, it almost sets yourself apart on that first contact as someone who is different versus someone who's just, and that's, we want to work with people who are different, don't we? We want to work with the people who stand out.
Yes, it shows the creative side. I've always done things very differently from everyone else. I attribute it to being left-handed. And what was I going to say? Oh, so when I became a salesperson in the early days, it was thought that women couldn't sell, and I was not permitted training. So I went into my clientele and asked them why they invited me in, what caught their attention, and that my clientele trained me how to sell. And that was the best training of all. So I always did everything differently. Another example, a manager a few years later went out with me on a call. And on the way back, he reprimanded me for half an hour in the car. And when we got out back into the office, he said, I want you to stop selling that way. He was upset that I talked about budget right up front when the professional conversation got underway. He said, I want you to start selling like everyone else. With a big smile, I said, I'll be happy to if you'll just answer one question. He said, sure, what's that? I said, if I'm doing everything wrong, can you tell me why I'm always at the top of the sales scoreboard? He ran into his office, then at 5 o'clock ran to his car, and that was the end of the conversation.
For sure. I mean, of course, all of this ties down to your success. If you're winning, it's as simple as that. And I know, maybe hopefully things have changed since then, but I think most sales managers, if you can pitch them on the results on something that you're doing and you go for it and you ask for permission, you ask for forgiveness rather than permission, I think there's the opportunity for success here. And just on that point, when you were talking before, and I want to wrap up with this because I think this is underutilized and really important for the audience, Elinor. And it's something that I do with one, getting guests on the show, and then two, closing deals on the partnership and the sponsorship side of things here. This multiple, not even multiple touch points, but multiple ways of communicating with people, whether that's you send them a kind of visual tweet or an image first, then you send them some kind of video email, then you leave them a voicemail. I think things like this are underrated because, we know how people are profiled. We know that some people are, kinesthetic, auditory, all the different segmentations. And, I'm aware of 4 of them, but I know that some profiles go to like 50 or 60, which may be too much depth for the average B2B sales professional. But leveraging all these touch points, I don't know if there's any data on this, but I think that's a way to quicken a relationship and deepen a relationship as well, because it's almost like you're tying more and more bits to the conversation versus just a string of emails that you're sat there in your office trying to get out as quick as possible because you're a procurement officer and you want to get home at 5 o'clock. So how important is it for us to, because you mentioned it before and I didn't want to gloss over it, I wanted to come back to it. How important is it for us to be on video calls or sending video messages or sending things in the post and strategically doing lots of different contact points versus more of the same?
I think it will catch attention, definitely, by varying how you approach people, and then you can readily see which communication style they prefer. In fact, once you get in on a meeting, you can ask them which caught their attention, and then you know how to continue communicating in their preferred style. I think you have to be very flexible when it comes to sales and communicating with people. Everyone's different.
Makes total sense. I appreciate that. You kind of took my wishy-washy question and pulled it back to, again, data of it's just an A/B test, a lot of this stuff, isn't it? And your A/B and this is where it gets powerful, I think. If you're A/B testing for an individual, then you're tailoring your solution, your communication, more than likely far higher than any of the sales reps that are competing for that business. So you're onto a good thing with that. And with that, Elinor, I've got one final question that I ask everyone that comes on the show. And that is, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give her to help her become better at selling?
You won't believe this. It ties into what we just spoke about. Be yourself. Don't try to fit in with a crowd. Distinguish yourself from everyone with your unique talent, DNA, and upbringing. Every decision, every experience we have makes us unique. Capitalize on that, leverage it, be yourself, and don't be afraid to tell your story. Share your story and listen to the stories of the people you meet. And that's where you find synergy. And once again, the sales begin to happen more readily.
I appreciate that. I think that's really empowering for the audience. So thank you for sharing that. And with that, Elinor, tell us a little bit where we can find out more about you, the keynotes, the books, all that good stuff. where can the audience who are super ravaged and want to learn more about selling through relationships, where can they find out more about you?
Thank you so much. I am an author. And again, distinguishing myself, people thought a woman couldn't possibly know enough about sales to be a trainer. So I was advised to write a book. All my books are on Amazon. The first one is Nice Girls Do Get the Sale, Relationship Building That Gets Results. It was featured in Time Magazine, CBS TV News, and became an international bestseller. Men are reading it today and tweeting it. I always advise you look for ways to provide community service. I was an embarrassment to the men, and so I, as a top producer, my accounts were always given to the men, and I was required to go find a new job at the end of each year. So my community service became teaching job seekers how to sell themselves on interviews. When the economy fell, I wrote the book Hired, How to Use Sales Techniques to Sell Yourself on Interviews, and it was featured on the FedEx kiosk coast to coast. And more recently, I wrote The Wish, a 360-degree business development process that fuels sales. Much of what you and I spoke about today is contained in the book. Again, they're all on Amazon. My website is Smooth Sale, and of course, that's SALE.net. And any questions, I'm Elinor, ELINOR, at smoothsale.net. And my phone is 408-209-0550, 408-209-0550. Thank you very much, Will. It was a pleasure speaking with you today.
You're more than welcome, Elinor. I'll link to all that in the show notes of this episode over at salesmanpodcast.com. And thanks again for joining us on the show.
Thank you.